For most of his life, Daniel Richardson had been labeled as the disappointment of the family. While his father, Thomas Richardson, proudly introduced his daughter Victoria as a respected cardiovascular surgeon and his son James as a successful corporate attorney, Daniel was always an afterthought. At family gatherings, the introductions followed the same predictable pattern. "This is Victoria, our daughter, the heart surgeon," his father would say with pride. "And this is James, our son, a partner at one of the city's top law firms." Then came the awkward pause before. "And this is Daniel. He does something with computers." The brief silence that followed spoke louder than words. To everyone in the room, Daniel was the son who had dropped out of law school after only one semester, the one who seemed unable to follow a respectable path like his siblings. What none of them knew or cared enough to ask was that Daniel had quietly built an extraordinary life. After leaving law school, he took a risk and launched a technology startup from a small apartment, working endless hours while everyone else assumed he was wasting his potential. Years later, he sold that company for $8 million and used the proceeds to build an even larger venture. His new company, Zenith Solutions, grew into a highly successful enterprise software business, serving major corporations across multiple countries. By the time he turned 31, the company was valued at nearly $180 million and employed hundreds of people. Yet Daniel never felt the need to brag about his achievements. At first, he tried to share his successes with his family, hoping they would show interest and perhaps even pride. But every conversation quickly shifted back to Victoria's surgeries or James's courtroom victories. Gradually, he stopped explaining. He stopped correcting their assumptions. Instead, he became curious. He wanted to know whether his family genuinely cared about him as a person or if their respect depended entirely on careers they could easily understand. So he remained silent, watching as year after year they continued to underestimate him, never realizing that the son they considered a failure had quietly become the most successful member of the family. 6 weeks before his father's 65th birthday, Daniel received an email invitation that appeared to be sent to the entire extended family. The celebration would take place at the prestigious Mountain Crest Resort, a luxury destination nestled in the mountains 3 hours north of Seattle. The event promised an elegant evening with cocktails, a formal dinner, live music, and nearly 180 guests, including business executives, longtime friends, and influential members of the community. Despite the complicated relationship he had with his family, Daniel felt a small sense of hope as he read the invitation. Perhaps this would be an opportunity to reconnect. Perhaps, for once, he could simply be part of the family without feeling like an outsider. He promptly replied that he would attend and thought little more about it. 3 days later, however, another email arrived. This one came directly from his father's personal account. As Daniel opened it, an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. The message was short, formal, and painfully clear. Thomas explained that after giving the matter some thought, he and Daniel's mother had decided the birthday celebration should be an adults-only event. Because many important business associates and professional contacts would be attending, they believed it would be best to maintain a certain atmosphere. Daniel, he wrote, would probably be busy with his computer projects anyway, and perhaps they could arrange a separate dinner at another time. Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. Adults only. He was 31 years old. He owned companies, managed hundreds of employees, negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars, and carried responsibilities far greater than most of the guests who would attend the party. Yet his father was still treating him as if he were an immature child who might embarrass the family. As he reread the email, old memories came rushing back. He remembered being 16 and hearing his father praise Victoria's perfect grades while barely acknowledging his own achievements. He remembered graduating high school and listening as relatives asked James about his future law career, while nobody seemed interested in Daniel's dreams. He remembered family dinners where every conversation revolved around medicine or law, while his attempts to talk about technology or entrepreneurship were met with polite smiles before the topic quickly changed. For years, he had convinced himself that things would improve once he became successful. Surely, he thought, when his family saw what he had built, they would finally respect him. But now, staring at his father's email, he realized something painful. The problem had never been his achievements. The problem was that they had already decided who he was long ago, and had never bothered to update that opinion. For several minutes, Daniel sat silently in his office. Anger flashed through his mind. He could have written a lengthy response. He could have listed every accomplishment his father knew nothing about. He could have reminded him that his so-called computer projects generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue every year. Instead, he typed a single word. Understood. Nothing more. No argument, no explanation, no complaint. His father's reply arrived less than an hour later. Thank you for understanding. This event is important for my professional reputation. Daniel read the sentence twice and felt something inside him go cold. The issue was not scheduling. It was not space. It was not family logistics. His father genuinely believed that Daniel's presence could damage his reputation. For the first time, Daniel stopped wondering whether he was imagining the favoritism. The evidence was sitting right in front of him. A few days later, his phone rang. It was Victoria. For a brief moment, Daniel wondered whether she had heard what happened and was calling to support him. Instead, after a few minutes of casual conversation, she asked if he knew anyone who could cheaply fix a broken website for the hospital. Daniel almost laughed. His company employed dozens of software engineers, yet his own sister still viewed him as a guy who knew something about websites. Before ending the call, Victoria casually asked whether he would be attending their father's birthday party. I wasn't invited, Daniel replied. There was a long silence. What? That doesn't make sense, she said. It wasn't a mistake. Dad specifically asked me not to come. Another pause followed. Then came the response that hurt more than he expected. Well, I'm sure he has his reasons. You know how he is about professional events. Daniel closed his eyes. Not once did she ask whether he was okay. Not once did she question why their father would exclude his own son from such an important family celebration. She simply accepted it. The call ended and Daniel sat alone in the silence of his office. That was the moment everything became clear. For years he had assumed that if he worked harder, achieved more, or proved himself enough, his family would eventually see his worth. But now he understood the truth. No one was coming to defend him. No one was going to challenge the narrative that he was the disappointing son. His father believed it. His siblings accepted it. And perhaps most painful of all, nobody cared enough to find out whether it was true. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that the birthday party his father had tried so hard to keep him away from would soon become the very event that exposed the truth to everyone in the room. What nobody in the Richardson family knew was that the story had started years before the birthday invitation ever arrived. In 2021, Daniel had quietly purchased Mountain Crest Resort through an investment company called Summit Holdings. The luxury property stretched across 50 acres of pristine wilderness surrounded by towering pine forests and breathtaking mountain views. The resort featured a grand lodge with elegant suites, private cabins overlooking crystal-clear lakes, a world-class restaurant, conference facilities, and event spaces capable of hosting hundreds of guests. The previous owners had listed the property for $28 million, but Daniel negotiated the purchase for $25 million in cash. Financially, it was a smart investment. The resort generated strong revenue and had significant growth potential. But there was another reason Daniel bought it. For years, his family had held special events there. They loved the place, praised its beauty, and recommended it to friends. Yet none of them had any idea that the son they considered a disappointment now owned every square foot of it. After acquiring the property, Daniel met with Patricia Chen, the resort director who had managed operations for nearly a decade. During their first meeting, he gave her one unusual instruction. If the Richardson family ever booked another event at Mountain Crest, she was to notify him immediately but never reveal his ownership. Patricia had been surprised by the request, but she agreed. Over the next 3 years, the resort flourished. Revenue increased dramatically. Guest satisfaction reached record levels, and the property's value rose significantly. All the while, Daniel remained a silent owner, watching from a distance as his family continued to underestimate him. When Patricia informed him that Thomas Richardson had reserved the resort for his 65th birthday celebration, Daniel immediately approved every request. The grand ballroom, premium catering, luxury accommodations, top-tier entertainment, everything his father wanted was granted without hesitation. After receiving the email that uninvited him from the event, however, Daniel made one additional decision. He instructed Patricia to upgrade the entire experience. The menu was expanded into a lavish 7-course dining experience featuring premium ingredients flown in from around the world. The wine selection was upgraded using some of the resort's most exclusive bottles. The open bar would serve top-shelf spirits throughout the night. A professional string quartet was hired to perform during cocktail hour, and every detail of the evening was carefully refined. There was something deeply ironic about the situation. The man who had been told he wasn't welcome at the celebration was personally ensuring that it became the most memorable event the resort had ever hosted. On the evening of the party, Mountain Crest looked magnificent. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Elegant lights illuminated the pathways leading to the grand ballroom, while luxury vehicles filled the parking areas. Nearly 180 guests had arrived, dressed in black tie attire and mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. Daniel arrived shortly after 6 o'clock through a private entrance reserved for ownership and senior management. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who no longer needed anyone's approval. Patricia greeted him in a private corridor and gave him a brief update. Everything was running flawlessly. The guests were enjoying cocktails. His father had already delivered a speech praising Victoria's medical career and James's success as an attorney. Daniel's name had barely been mentioned. For a moment, Patricia studied him carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "I've spent 10 years pretending none of this bothered me. Tonight I want the truth to be visible." Minutes later, he stepped through the entrance of the grand ballroom. At first, nobody noticed him. Then a cousin spotted him near the doorway. "Daniel." The single word cut through the crowd. Heads began turning. Conversations slowed. One by one, family members looked toward the entrance. Daniel's mother froze. Victoria's eyes widened. James lowered his drink. And across the room, Thomas Richardson slowly turned around. For several seconds, father and son simply stared at each other. Shock quickly transformed into anger. Thomas excused himself from a conversation with several executives and walked directly toward Daniel. "What are you doing here?" he demanded quietly. "I'm attending a party," Daniel replied. His father glanced around nervously. "We already discussed this, did we? This is not an appropriate event for you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because these are important people." The words landed like a punch. Around them, guests pretended not to listen, but the silence spreading through the room made it obvious that everyone was paying attention. His mother arrived moments later. "Daniel, please," she whispered. "Don't do this." "Do what?" Daniel asked calmly. "I just arrived." Thomas lowered his voice. "I'm asking you to leave. And I'm asking why." The tension became unbearable. His father's face reddened. Finally, he snapped. "Because these people are executives, business owners, and community leaders. They have accomplished things. I don't need them asking about my son and having to explain that he spends his life running some internet hobby." The words echoed in Daniel's ears. Internet hobby. Even after everything. Even now. That was still how his father saw him. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria looked horrified. James stared at the floor. Daniel nodded slowly. "An internet hobby," he repeated. At that exact moment, Patricia Chen approached the group. Her timing was perfect. "Excuse me, Mr. Richardson," she said politely. Thomas turned toward her. "Yes. The property owner has arrived and needs to discuss tonight's event with you." Clearly irritated, Thomas sighed. "Can't it wait?" "I'm afraid not, sir." "What possible issue could there be?" Patricia looked directly at Daniel. "Perhaps the owner can explain." Confusion spread across Thomas's face. His eyes moved from Patricia to Daniel and back again. "What are you talking about?" Patricia stepped forward and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Mr. Richardson, allow me to formally introduce Daniel Richardson, owner of Mountain Crest Resort." Silence. Absolute silence. The music seemed to disappear. The conversation stopped. For several seconds, nobody moved. Thomas stared at Patricia as if she had spoken another language. Then he looked at Daniel. Then back at Patricia. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible." Patricia calmly opened a tablet and displayed the ownership documents. Mountain Crest Resort was acquired by Summit Holdings in 2021. Daniel Richardson is the sole owner and managing member. Thomas stared at the screen. His hands trembled. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Beside him, Daniel's mother looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Victoria blinked repeatedly. James immediately pulled out his phone. "You own this place," his mother whispered. Daniel nodded. "Yes. The entire resort. Every acre." James looked up from his phone. "No way." "There is a way," Daniel replied. Victoria stared at him. "When did this happen?" 3 years ago." Nobody spoke. The revelation was still sinking in. Then came the second shock. Thomas finally found his voice. "How could you possibly afford this?" Daniel looked directly at his father. The same way I built everything else you never asked about." The room remained frozen. "I sold my first company for $8 million. Then I founded Zenith Solutions. The company currently serves clients in 14 countries. Last year's revenue exceeded $47 million. Current valuation is approximately $180 million. Every face around him changed. Disbelief, confusion, embarrassment, regret. Guests who had been eavesdropping openly stared now. Some recognized the company name immediately. Others pulled out phones and began searching. Within minutes, whispers spread throughout the ballroom. "He's worth hundreds of millions. That's his company. He's the resort owner." His father tried to kick him out. Daniel watched the realization spread across the faces of everyone present. Victoria looked stunned. James appeared speechless. His mother seemed close to tears. But the expression he would never forget belonged to his father. For the first time in his life, Thomas Richardson looked at his son and realized that the person he had spent years dismissing was not a failure, not an embarrassment, and certainly not someone to be hidden away from important guests. He was looking at the most successful person in the room, and everyone knew it. The silence that followed the revelation felt heavier than any argument Daniel could have made. For years, he had imagined what it would feel like if his family finally learned the truth about his life. He had pictured surprise, perhaps even pride. Instead, what he saw on their faces was something far more complicated: shock, mixed with embarrassment, confusion, mixed with regret. The narrative they had repeated for over a decade was collapsing in front of them, and they had no idea how to respond. His mother was the first to speak. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Daniel let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Tell you what exactly? About the resort? About your company? About all of this?" For a moment he simply looked at her. Then he shook his head. "I did tell you." His mother frowned. "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did. Hundreds of times." The confusion on her face only deepened. "I talked about my projects. I talked about contracts. I talked about building software platforms. I talked about hiring employees and expanding into new markets. Every time I brought it up, the conversation lasted about 30 seconds before someone changed the subject. Nobody answered. Because nobody could deny it." Daniel continued. "You didn't know because you never wanted to know." His words landed like a hammer. For years he had protected their feelings, making excuses for them. Tonight, for the first time, he stopped. His mother swallowed hard. "We didn't realize it was important." Daniel stared at her. "No, you didn't realize because you never asked." The words hung in the air. "You never asked." That simple sentence contained 10 years of disappointment. 10 years of trying to share pieces of his life only to be ignored. 10 years of sitting at family dinners while conversations revolved around surgeries, court cases, promotions, and achievements that everyone considered respectable. Meanwhile, the son who had quietly built an international company worth hundreds of millions of dollars had become invisible. Victoria looked down. James avoided eye contact. Neither of them could find a response. Because deep down they knew he was right. The conversation might have ended there, but the evening was far from over. Word had already begun spreading throughout the ballroom. Within minutes, guests started approaching Daniel one after another. At first it was cautious curiosity. Then it became genuine interest. A venture capital executive introduced herself and asked about Zenith Solutions. A technology consultant wanted to discuss enterprise software trends. A manufacturing CEO had heard of Daniel's company and complimented its reputation in the industry. For the first time that evening, Daniel found himself having conversations with people who actually understood what he had built. They didn't dismiss his work as an internet hobby. They asked thoughtful questions. They understood the challenges of scaling a company. They understood leadership. They understood risk. One investor spent nearly 15 minutes discussing growth strategies and market expansion. Another executive asked how Zenith Solutions had secured contracts with major corporations. Daniel answered comfortably, speaking about technology infrastructure, operational efficiency, and long-term business planning. Around them, guests listened with growing respect. Several were visibly impressed. Some even admitted they had heard of Zenith Solutions before realizing Daniel was its founder. Across the room, Thomas Richardson watched everything unfold. And for the first time in his life, he experienced something deeply uncomfortable. Strangers understood his son better than he did. People who had met Daniel less than 20 minutes earlier knew more about his career than his own father. One guest praised Daniel's leadership philosophy. Another mentioned an interview Daniel had given to a business publication. A third referenced his recognition on a prestigious entrepreneurial list. Thomas stood silently listening. Every compliment felt like another reminder of how little attention he had paid. Eventually, someone directly asked Daniel about his achievements. He answered matter-of-factly. Zenith Solutions currently operates in 14 countries. A few eyebrows rose. Our annual revenue exceeded $47 million last year. Several guests exchanged impressed glances. We recently signed a multi-million-dollar government contract. The room grew even quieter. Daniel wasn't bragging. He wasn't exaggerating. He was simply stating facts. Facts his family should have known years ago. Then someone asked about the Forbes article. Daniel smiled slightly. It was several years ago, nothing life-changing. But the reaction from the guests suggested otherwise. For them, these accomplishments were extraordinary. For his family, they were completely new information. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, as dinner ended and guests moved toward the terrace overlooking the mountains, Thomas finally approached his son. The celebration continued behind them, but neither man paid attention. The cool night air carried the distant sounds of laughter and music. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Why did you hide all this?" Daniel stared out at the mountains. The question almost made him laugh, because it perfectly illustrated the problem. Even now, his father still didn't understand. He turned slowly. "I didn't hide anything." Thomas frowned. "You never told us." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You never listened." The words hit harder than any accusation. His father looked away. Daniel continued. "For years I tried to talk to you. Silence. I told you about my first startup. Nothing. I told you when we landed major clients. Nothing. I told you when we expanded internationally. Nothing. I told you when I sold my first company. Still nothing." You smiled. You nodded. Then you went back to talking about Victoria's surgeries or James's cases. Thomas opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Because every memory Daniel described was true. "I kept waiting for you to ask questions." Daniel's voice remained calm, but the hurt behind it was impossible to miss. "I kept thinking maybe next time you'd be interested." He paused. "Eventually, I stopped trying." The mountains stretched endlessly before them. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Thomas asked quietly, "You really think I never cared?" Daniel looked directly into his father's eyes. "I think you cared about the version of me you created in your head." His father visibly flinched. "You decided I was the son who failed when I left law school." Another pause. "And after that, you stopped paying attention." For the first time all evening, Thomas had no defense, no explanation, no excuse. Only silence. The silence of a man realizing that the greatest misunderstanding of his life wasn't about money, success, or business. It was about his own son. And standing there beneath the night sky of the resort Daniel owned, surrounded by people who respected achievements he had never bothered to understand, Thomas Richardson was finally forced to confront a painful truth. Daniel had never been a disappointment. The disappointment had been the family that refused to see him. The days following Thomas Richardson's birthday party were strangely quiet for Daniel. Outwardly, life continued as normal. He returned to running Zenith Solutions, attending meetings, reviewing contracts, and managing the growing demands of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet his phone told a different story. Messages arrived constantly. Victoria called several times, leaving increasingly emotional voicemails. James sent long text messages explaining that he had spent hours researching Zenith Solutions and was shocked by what he discovered. Their mother called almost every day, asking him to return her calls and reminding him that family should not stay divided for long. Daniel read every message, listened to every voicemail, and responded to none of them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't interested in defending himself, explaining himself, or convincing anyone of his worth. He had spent years trying to earn recognition from people who had never bothered to understand him. Now he simply needed space. About a week later, his phone rang again. This time it was his father. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello, Dad." The voice on the other end sounded different somehow, less confident, less certain. "Daniel," Thomas said quietly. "I've been thinking about everything that happened." Daniel remained silent. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Thomas continued. "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked out the window of his office toward the Seattle skyline. "I know I hurt you," his father said. "I know I dismissed what you built because I didn't understand it. And I know what I said at the party was wrong. For years, Daniel had imagined hearing those words. Yet now that they had finally arrived, they did not magically erase the pain. "I appreciate the apology," he said. The answer surprised his father. "That's all. What else would you like me to say?" Thomas sighed. "I was hoping we could fix this." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Dad, you spent 10 years creating this problem. It isn't going to disappear after one phone call." The silence that followed was uncomfortable but honest. For the first time, neither of them was pretending. Several weeks passed before the next important moment arrived. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Daniel's assistant called from the lobby. "There's someone here to see you." "Who?" "Thomas Richardson." Daniel froze. His father had never visited Zenith Solutions before. Not once. Not in 10 years. "Send him up." A few minutes later, Thomas stepped into the company's headquarters. He stopped immediately. The office stretched across an entire floor overlooking the city. Teams of engineers collaborated in modern workspaces. Conference rooms displayed project plans and software architecture diagrams. Screens throughout the office tracked real-time performance metrics and international operations. Employees moved confidently through the building, greeting Daniel with respect and familiarity. Thomas slowly looked around. "This is your company." Daniel nodded. "Welcome to Zenith." For nearly an hour, Daniel showed him around. They walked through development teams, operations centers, client support departments, and executive meeting rooms. Employees stopped to greet Daniel. Managers updated him on projects. Team leaders discussed strategy and future growth. Thomas watched everything carefully. For the first time, he wasn't seeing his son through old assumptions. He was seeing reality. He was seeing hundreds of people whose careers existed because of Daniel's leadership. He was seeing ideas transformed into something real. He was seeing the result of 10 years of persistence that he had never bothered to understand. Finally, they returned to Daniel's office. Thomas sat quietly for several moments. Then he shook his head. "I had no idea." Daniel smiled sadly. "I know." His father looked around once more. "I thought you were still trying to find your place in the world." Daniel said nothing. The truth spoke for itself. Thomas lowered his eyes. "The truth is, I never looked hard enough." For the first time, Daniel believed that his father genuinely understood. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to begin changing. That Thanksgiving felt different from any family gathering that had come before it. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Years of misunderstandings don't disappear overnight. People were careful with their words. Conversations started slowly. But something unexpected happened. Instead of making assumptions, they asked questions. Real questions. Victoria wanted to know how Daniel built his first company. James asked about government contracts and international expansion. Their mother asked what motivated him to keep going during difficult years. And for the first time, they actually listened to the answers. No one interrupted. No one changed the subject. No one dismissed his accomplishments as computer projects or internet hobbies. They listened because they were genuinely interested. And that simple act meant more to Daniel than any apology ever could. Later that evening after dinner, Thomas stood and raised a glass. The room fell silent. "I want to say something," he began. His voice carried an honesty that had been missing for years. "I spent a long time believing success only came in forms I understood. Medicine, law, traditional careers. Because of that, I failed to recognize the incredible things my son accomplished." He turned toward Daniel. "I was wrong. No excuses. No calificación. No conditions. Just the truth. I am proud of what you've built. But more importantly, I'm proud of the person who built it." Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not complete forgiveness. Not instant healing. Something better. A beginning. The family raised their glasses together. And for the first time in many years, Daniel felt seen. Not because of the resort. Not because of the money. Not because of the awards, the company valuation, or the business success. But because the people around the table were finally trying to understand who he really was. As the evening came to an end, Daniel realized the most important lesson of all. A person's value is not determined by recognition titles, wealth, or the approval of others. True worth exists whether people acknowledge it or not. Success does not require validation. At the same time, respect cannot be built on assumptions, stereotypes, or outdated judgments. Real respect comes from curiosity, from listening, from taking the time to understand someone before deciding who they are. For years, Daniel had searched for acceptance from his family. In the end, he discovered something far more important. He never needed their approval to be successful. But genuine understanding when it finally arrived was worth more than approval ever could be. And that was where the story truly ended, not with victory, revenge, or humiliation, but with growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of a better future built on mutual respect.